So over the last few days, one of the draft scripts for Bohemian Rhapsody came online, and I thought we'd go through it and break it down, have a look at it, and see why it was very much a different film to the one we got. So both the film and this script begin with a flash forward to where the film will eventually end. In the final film, that is the excitement and the build-up towards Live Aid. In this script, however, it is the moment of Freddie's death, which is definitely a much more depressing way to open your film. It's definitely an interesting contrast in the two stories, you know, starting one so sad and depressing and the other one starting on such a positive and exciting vibe. It definitely is a good representation of the change in tone from this script to the final story they ended up with. Now, what's different about this version of the film right from the get-go is that the story of the film is essentially being retold by a present-day Brian May to an online blogger. Now, this is interesting because as you go through the story, it does kind of add a bit more depth to the other members of the band, especially the Brian character. You kind of see a bit more of how he saw Freddie's life. It's definitely a story that still focuses very much on Freddie, perhaps even more so than the final film. We do get to touch upon the fact that the other members of the band, you know, were getting involved in some troubled times as well, but we also get to see Brian's perspective and him saying stuff like maybe he should have intervened and maybe they could have done more to help Freddie, you know, when he was getting pulled astray by people like Paul Prenter and stuff like that. So it adds an interesting element to the story, but I think it does seem kind of out of character the way they write Brian May, at least in these scenes anyway. Now, one thing you notice early on about this script is that it seems a bit more realistic and it seems a bit more accurate in terms of the historical facts. Comparing this to the final film, the film seems more like a fantasy retelling of the story to some extent. This script feels more realistic, feels more gritty, it feels a bit more grounded in reality. It's kind of like comparing, I guess, you know, Marvel movies to some of the DC stuff like the Batman v Supermans and stuff like that. You know, you've got Marvel's more fantastical and all that kind of stuff, and those DC films were a bit more, you know, grounded in reality. And this script kind of feels a bit more like that, you know. When the movie was first released, one of the criticisms from the film critics was that it kind of pulled its punches, you know, it kind of glossed over some of the more raunchy sides of the story, some of the partying elements of Freddie's life in particular and of the band's lifestyle and all that kind of stuff. And this script definitely doesn't pull those punches, you know, it goes full pelt with it, and you get the impression that this was very much a film written for a more mature audience than the PG-13 film we kind of got at the end of the road. A little later on this video, we're going to go through one of the party scenes in this script, and you'll kind of see the comparison between that and the more tame party scene we got in the final movie. This script is also more in line with real events to some extent. A clear example of that is when the band are recording We Will Rock You. Obviously that was one of those moments that was time shifted quite significantly. In the film it takes place in the early 80s, whereas in reality it took place in the kind of mid to late 70s. And in this version of the script, that's kind of when that happens. You know, We Will Rock You is being written and recorded in the kind of late 70s. It's time shifted a little bit still because that process of writing and recording that song does take place after Queen have gone on tour with We Are the Champions. So it's a little bit after when it actually took place, but it's obviously a change from the significant time shift in the film. There are also other examples of moments from Queen history that are in this script that we don't see in the final film, such as Queen's South America tour in the early 80s, and we also get to see some stuff from their free concert in Hyde Park in 1976. So it's kind of a shame that these moments didn't make it into the final film. The Death on Two Legs storyline also gets briefly mentioned by Brian when he says the line, "The problem was our old record deals were rigged to make other people money, so we switched management." It doesn't really go into any more detail than that, but it is nice that this was referenced. One of the interesting lines from Ray Foster in this script is where he says, "Well, I need not tell you that it's make or break time. I think you have to agree we have been patient with you, hoping for a breakthrough that I'm afraid just hasn't come." This is interesting because in the final film, when it comes to Queen working on the Night at the Opera album, they've essentially gone from one success to another, so there's no real pressure on them. This version of the story seems to be much more in line with the real events, you know, the pressure that Queen were under. When they went to recording A Night at the Opera, it really was a do or die kind of time, that if that album wasn't a success, they would have had to break up. So I kind of prefer this element of the story where that pressure's on them. It makes it a bit more interesting when they're recording that Night at the Opera album that they do actually have pressure on them, and yet they're still taking the risk. So before I mentioned that the film pulls its punches a bit more than this script does, and there's nowhere where that's more clear than in the two party scenes in the film and in this script. In the film we kind of get a party at Freddie's house that is quite tame compared to what you'd expect to see from rock stars in the height of their success. In this script, there's a party scene that takes place in New Orleans, and this is just some of the entertainment that's on offer at that particular party. Naked dancers, magicians, Zulu tribesmen, contortionists, John and his wife are served champagne by naked waiters and waitresses who carry their tips in their bodily crevices. Nude models of both sexes wrestle in huge baths of shimmering uncooked liver. Hermaphrodite dwarfs deliver coke on trays strapped to their heads. So as you can see, this party scene was a lot more crazy and over the top and extravagant than the one we got in the film. What's really crazy about all this is that the party presented in this script is a lot more accurate and realistic to the kind of stories you hear from people who lived through those parties back in the day. Now clearly most of the stuff that was presented in that scene wouldn't have fit the PG-13 rating the film eventually went for. It's disappointing that they didn't try and put in a bit more of this, at least as much as they could, into the final film, because it is a good representation of the level of excess that not only Freddie but the entire band went through their heyday. Another interesting aspect of this script is that, to some extent, it presents John Reid as the villain of the film, almost more so than Paul Prenter. While Paul Prenter still leads Freddie astray and still doesn't get on with Mary and the rest of the band and eventually sells out Freddie's secrets to the press, it's actually Reid who pushes the idea, at least initially, of Freddie going solo. He also seems to be against the idea of Bohemian Rhapsody and finds the other members of the band to be a nuisance and holding Freddie back. I think they definitely made the right decision changing that around in the final film. Now we know there were a bunch of scenes that were filmed that didn't make the final cut, such as the performance of 39 and the whole Japan tour. Now while most of these scenes aren't in this original draft of the script, one of these particular scenes does seem to be in there. The scene features Freddie and Paul Prenter stumbling out of a gay nightclub in the early hours of the morning and having a run-in with some meatpackers working in the alleyway. Now this scene does sound like it was actually filmed, and there does seem to be some photos around of that particular scene, and we get an idea of what that scene entailed here in this script. Now there's a character in this script called Joe Baston who didn't make it into the final film. He works at EMI and is really the first guy that Freddie has any sort of romantic or physical relationship with. There's an intriguing scene towards the end of the film where Freddie visits Joe in hospital as Joe is going through his final stages of his battle with AIDS. Much like the scene in the film where Freddie watches a news report on the effects of AIDS, this scene does a good job of representing what Freddie has to go through and what he faces down the line. Honestly, I reckon this scene would have worked a little better if they could find a way to keep this character in the film. I think it hits a little closer to home when it's someone that Freddie knows, and for us the viewer it's someone that we've known from earlier in the film. This script definitely goes into a bit more detail about Freddie's sexuality and just what exactly happened in those gay nightclubs back in the day. They mention a secret basement in one of those clubs that was exclusive to those who had been given a key. And a line from the older Brian May says, "I heard later that every person granted the privilege of getting their very own key to that door is dead." Now apparently that's actually a true story. It's been reported around the place that there was actually a basement where a lot of stuff went down in one of these clubs, and everyone who was given their own key to that room eventually contracted the disease and died. So that's, pretty sad and depressing when you think about it. So while this script is definitely an interesting read, I can't help but feel like we got the much better version of the story with the final film that we did. While there's definitely some interesting and some cool parts in this script that weren't in the final film, overall we got a much more uplifting and positive and inspirational film than this one, which is a bit more dark and depressing. So I think if you compare the two, we probably got the better version of the story in the film that we did. So guys, thanks for watching. Let us know your thoughts on this script and all the differences between this and the final film in the comments below. Did you think the script was better or worse than the final film? And until next time, I guess I'll see you later.